Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another video lecture for Psych 370. In my previous video lecture, I talked about shaping, right? Which is a training technique that involves reinforcing behaviors that more and more closely approximate some kind of goal behavior. And in this video lecture, I'm going to talk about a similar kind of training technique, which is called chaining. Now, guys, the reason I said that chaining is similar to shaping is because, like shaping, chaining also involves starting simple and then building something more complex through reinforcement. So, in that sense, they are similar techniques. However, the difference between them is that with chaining, the animal doesn't just learn one response, it learns an entire sequence of responses, and it learns to connect those responses kind of like the links of a chain. So you might use shaping to get the animal to perform one individual response, but then chaining would be involved when you then taught the animal to link that response together with another one so that that second response begins as soon as the first one ends. That's how chaining works. So for example, this picture is illustrating a behavior chain where a rat has learned to climb up a ramp, then cross a drawbridge, then climb a ladder, then cross a tightrope, then climb another ladder, then crawl through a tunnel, and then it rides down this elevator here. When it gets to the bottom, it sees a lever, and when it presses the lever, it can get some food. So each letter in this picture represents one link, right? Represents one response that the rat has acquired, and the rat has learned to chain those responses together in order to obtain food. Now, I also have a video with a similar kind of behavior chain being performed by a chicken, so I want to show that to you now. Okay, so again, the chicken would have had to learn all of those different behaviors individually, right? Those trainers would have had to use shaping to get the chicken to climb up the ramp, to make the U-turn, to cross the bridge, and so on. But the chicken has also learned to chain those responses together into one sequence with the food occurring at the end of the sequence. And this diagram on this slide depicts yet another example of a behavior chain. So in this case, a rat has learned to climb a ladder to a platform where it finds a rope hanging from a ceiling. The rat then pulls the rope, which opens a door. The rat runs through the door where it finds a chute. It slides down to the bottom of the chute where it sees a lever. And if it presses the lever, then it gets some food. So just like in the other examples, the rat doesn't actually receive the food. It doesn't actually get that primary reinforcer until it performs the last response in the behavior chain, right? But the other earlier responses in the chain are maintained by secondary reinforcement. So for example, the rat associates the side of the lever with food, right? Because it's experienced repeated pairings of those two stimuli. Over and over again, this rat has seen the lever, then gotten some food. There's the lever, there's the food. Those two stimuli have been paired repeatedly for the rat, so it now associates seeing the lever with getting food. And so when it slides down the chute, that behavior produces the side of the lever, and so the side of the lever acts as a secondary reinforcer for that behavior. Going one step farther back, it runs through the door because that behavior results in the side of the chute, which it associates with the side of the lever, which it associates with food. And so the side of the chute reinforces the behavior of running through the door. And so, guys, each stimulus in the middle of this chain here acts as a secondary reinforcer for the behavior that came before it. And not only that, but each of those stimuli actually has another function too. It also acts as a discriminative stimulus for the next response in the chain. So, for example, when the animal sees the door, that stimulus signals to it that the next reinforcer, the side of the chute, is available to it if it runs through the door. And then not only does the side of the chute reinforce that link, not only does it reinforce that behavior of running through the door, but it also acts as a discriminative stimulus. It also signals that the next reinforcer, the side of the lever, is available to it if it slides down the chute. And so, guys, in this example, the first stimulus, the side of the ladder, is just a discriminative stimulus, right? And the last stimulus, the food, is just a reinforcer. But all these other stimuli in the middle of the chain are actually playing two roles. Each one reinforces the previous response in the chain, and it also acts as a discriminative stimulus for the next response in the chain. And so, guys, that dual functionality of the stimuli in the middle of the chain here, where they both act as a secondary reinforcer for the previous response and a discriminative stimulus for the next response, that's one way to look at how a behavior chain like this could be maintained. But next, let's consider the issue of how you might get the animal to perform a behavior chain like that in the first place. The first thing that you need to do is something called task analysis, which, as the name suggests, involves analyzing the task that you want the person or the animal to perform and then breaking it down into its component pieces. So, in other words, task analysis is all about identifying the individual links that are going to make up the behavior chain. So, what are the responses that are going to constitute this behavior chain? That's what your task analysis should tell you. So, for example, if you wanted to teach a child to wash their hands, then your task analysis might look something like what you're seeing on this slide. So, to complete the chain of behaviors that makes up that task, the child would need to approach the sink, turn on the water, get their hands wet, apply some soap, rub their hands together, rinse their hands off, turn off the water, and then dry their hands. So that's the first step in any chaining procedure. You got to perform a task analysis first so that you know what responses the behavior chain is going to involve. But of course, you might find it very difficult to shape an entire sequence like that all at once. I mean, you could do that. That's one approach to training a behavior chain, and it's called the total task method. But a more common option would be to train one individual step first and then add steps as you go. So, guys, there are two basic ways of teaching people and animals to perform behavior chains like that. And we call them forward chaining and backward chaining. Now, in backward chaining, you start by training the last response in the chain. So, you use shaping if you need to get the person or the animal to acquire that last response. And then you add in the previous responses. So you train the last response first, and then you link the previous responses to it. That's how backward chaining works. So, for example, to go back to the rat example from before, you might first get the rat to press the lever for food. So you might start out by shaping it to press that lever. And then once it's doing that, you'd train it to slide down the chute. So, since the rat should associate the side of the lever with food, and since sliding down the chute produces the side of the lever should reinforce the rat for sliding down the chute. Now, early on in the training process, you might need to shape that sliding response with food. So, you might have to use a primary reinforcer like that at first. But eventually, the behavior of sliding down the chute will be maintained by the secondary reinforcement that the side of the lever provides. And of course, once the animal is reliably performing the last two responses in the chain like that, then you can start shaping the third to last response. Once it's been added to the chain, you can add in the fourth to last response, and so on until you reach that first link that you identified in your task analysis. So again, that's how backward chaining works, and I'll show you a video now as an example of how you might use backward chaining to teach a child to wash their hands.
Wash hands. Okay, we're gonna turn water on, get soap, rub hands, scrub, 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 rub, rub, rub. Excellent, water off. Great job, your hands are all clean now. Here, use your fruit treat.
In this example, we see the instructor prompting the student to turn on water, get soap, rub hands, rinse hands, and turn off water. The instructor stops before the last behavior, and the student must complete the last behavior of drying hands independently in order to receive reinforcement. Then, reinforce your student's independent performance of the next to last and last behaviors in order.
Wash hands. You're going to turn water on, get soap, rub your hands, rub, 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 scrub, scrub, scrub. Great job! You remembered all by yourself. That's excellent. Here's your free treat.
Now you see the instructor prompts the student to turn on water, get soap, rub hands, and rinse hands, but then stops so that the student must complete the last two behaviors of turning off water and drying hands in order to get the reinforcer. Then reinforce your student's independent performance of the last three steps in order and continue in this manner until your student can complete the entire chain independently following the SD.
Okay, so notice in backward chaining, the person or the animal isn't actually performing the chain backwards, right? The responses are always being performed in the proper sequence. We just call it backward chaining because it involves adding the links in this back to front kind of manner. So like you saw there, that kid first learns to perform the last link in the chain, right? They first learned to dry their hands independently. And then once they could do that, they learned how to do the last two links in order, then the last three links in order, and so on. So if that's how backward chaining works, then you can probably guess that in forward chaining, you do it the other way around. In forward chaining, you start by reinforcing the first response in the chain, and then you add in the following ones. So in that video that you just saw, the instructor could have used forward chaining. They could have had the kid turn on the water on their own, then helped them with the rest of the process. Then later on, they could have had the kid turn on the water and get their hands wet. Later, they could have had the kid turn on the water, get their hands wet, and apply the soap, and so on. So that would be forward chaining. Or with the rat, you could start by shaping the first response of climbing up the ladder. You could use food to shape that behavior first. And then once the rat is doing that, you could stop reinforcing it for just climbing the ladder, and you could start shaping up the second response in the chain. So for example, now you might reinforce the rat if it climbs up the ladder and moves toward the rope. Then you might reinforce it for climbing up the ladder and touching the rope. Then you might require it to climb up the ladder and actually grab the rope, and so on. And so again, you're using shaping to teach the animal to perform each link in the chain. And once they seem to have mastered one response, then you start working on another one. But the difference is obviously that in forward chaining, you're adding those responses from the beginning of the chain to the end of it, instead of starting with the last response and then working your way back to the first one. Okay, so there are a few different ways that you can go about teaching a person or an animal to perform a behavior chain. And which one is most effective is something that researchers have actually spent some time arguing about. So some people thought that forward chaining ought to be your first choice because with it, you're preserving the natural sequence of the task, right? You're teaching it start to finish, just like it's going to be performed. But then some studies came out suggesting that maybe backward chaining might work better. So for example, in one study, pilot trainees learned landing sequences best when they practiced the actual landing first, then added in the runway approach, then the descent, and so on. So they did best when they worked backward like that. They did best with backward chaining. But then on the other hand, other research has found the opposite, with forward chaining working better. So I think it's fair to say that the consensus at this point is that there's really no one superior technique, and which one works better might just depend on the task itself. It might just depend on the nature of the behavior chain itself. So a good question to ask is probably, which part of this chain that I'm trying to teach is more difficult? Is the first part of it more difficult, or is the last part of it more difficult? Because if you use forward chaining, then the person or the animal is going to get the most practice with the first part of the chain, right? And if you use backward chaining, then they're going to get the most practice with the last part of the chain. So, whichever part is more difficult, it might be a wise strategy to start with that part, right? So, for example, with those pilots that I mentioned, the landing is the hardest part. That's the part that it's most important to get right. So, with those pilots, starting with the landing and then working backward from there makes a lot of sense for that particular behavior chain. But in another study, people learned these Olympic weightlifting techniques best when they were taught with forward chaining versus when they were taught with backward chaining. And that seems to make a lot of sense for that kind of chain too. It probably makes more sense to teach someone how to get the weight off of the ground first before you teach them the other steps in the chain. So anyway, guys, the point here is it doesn't seem like there's one best way to apply chaining. So the forward chaining, backward chaining, and total task chaining methods all have evidence to support their effectiveness. And which one works best might just depend on the specific kind of chain that you're trying to teach. Okay, well, that's going to just about do it for this video lecture on chaining. Please let me know if you have any questions about chaining, and I hope you have a great day. Take care.